You actually recording?
I'm just a start.
Oh, okay. Oh, you already did?
No, I just
okay. So, essentially, no, we're not going to do game theory. It's unnecessarily complicated. No one in the real world thinks in, let's see, if I do this, he's going to do this, and if he does this, then I'm going to do this. Well, he has three options to keep the price high, average or low. And then they have the same option. Now they begin to strategize. I'm going to figure out what the other CEO will do, or he'll figure out what I will do. And then if he does this and I do this, then all of these. Then you get into dominant strategies. Then you have into dominated strategies, and all of those things. And unfortunately, economists like to present this whole story as if this is how the real world operates. The reason is that most of microeconomics has been exhausted as a fertile ground for publishing in the first 50 years of 20th century. So game theory came up in 60s, 70s, 80s. It came up as a ground where professors could just publish and publish. They can write books on game theory and how to strategize and how to do all of those things. So at one point in a couple of decades, half of everything in microeconomics, all publications were, well, let's try to devise a game. If the game goes, now we have a consecutive game where, one pizza shop changes its price, then the other pizza shop reacts and changes its own price. Then the first pizza shop, seeing what the price of the second was, adjusts its price. Then the second, seeing what the first did, adjusts its price. So each reacts to the one by adjusting the other. Or you can have a different alternative where you can actually have that both of them have to do the same decision at the same time. Let's say Christmas time. So for Christmas time, they got to do their Christmas pricing on the same day. And they observe what happens, and then the next Christmas they repeat all over again. And then the Christmas after that they repeat all over again. So you have sequential moves, or you have simultaneous moves. And all of these little things allow for providing for different games with different strategies, and this means a lot of publications. Then you provide an optimal solution, then there is a non-optimal solution, then you provide an example that has two alternative solutions where both end up with high prices or where they both end up with low prices. And if you have two solutions, now we have to have some random effect, which, in other words, this is a whole story where tens of thousands of articles are published and becomes a, how do you call it, a fashion. So economics suffers from fashions like any other industry, especially the fashion industry. But even what we're talking about, Hollywood. Now, Hollywood also suffers from fashion. Fashion to do about these types of movies, or that types of, or the horror types of movies, or the comedies, or whatever these are. So this has been a 2-decade-long fashion within the economics profession, game theory, where essentially economists will race to publish more and to make their brand names, and someone will take a particular field within game theory, publish one, find a particular oddity, publish a second one. Oh, but what if we have 3 players instead of 2? Well, then the solution changes. Okay, that's another publication. Well, what if we have 4 people? Well, the solution changes again. Well, what if we have so many people, n number of people, Then they begin to talk about, well, is the solution really stable? For example, the prices are stable, won't go up or down. For example, with airline industry, you have these price wars occasionally. So solutions are extremely unstable. They try to keep the prices high. At one point, they just slash prices big time, and they get up into a price war. Somehow, the war wears out all the players. They say, okay, we had enough war, we're sick and tired of the war. Of course, they're bleeding with a lot of losses. Let's raise the prices again. They raise the prices again. Then there is the topic of, well, is there collusion when, 3 or 4 companies decide simultaneously to raise? Well, did they actually do it together? And they, the bosses called each other and coordinated, which in the greatest country in the world is strictly illegal. In Bulgaria, they do it all the time. Or if the market just allows for coordinating mechanism. And a lot of economists get into the job of showing that it is optimal for them to do it and to follow each other, so as that, oh no, they didn't really agree on it. In other words, it was a bad, meaning illegal behavior. Economists were on the job to prove that, oh no, it's not really illegal. It is natural. We show it and we prove it with game theory. So
I don't understand.
You don't understand what?
The game theory.
Well, game theory is essentially when person A, now I'm beginning the lecture of game theory. What is game theory? Game theory is essentially playing a game. Where, you know, I think what you will do and you think what I will do. And, for example, we're two pizza shops. And I can put in for a pizza price 6, a 7, or 8. And you can put the price of 6, a 7, or 8. So, you put in your price at 8 and I say, oh, I'm going to put my price at 6 and I'm going to steal all of your customers. So your price is at 8 and I put in one big sign, $6 pizza, alright? And I'm going to steal 90% of your customers. What is it you're going to do?
Reduce the price. Lower the price.
Lower the price or do nothing?
Of course, they lower the price, but I have a question.
Okay, what's the question?
How does it increase the publication, you said? Or?
Yes. Oh, well, you just designed a particular game. He finds a very optimal solution. He finds that after...
He designs a game.
Yeah, design a particular game.
So it's that theory in his head. It's not true.
Yes, we call it game theory because it's theory. Because it's based on mathematics, because it requires mathematical solutions. And these mathematical solutions require certain mathematics. So, you have your game. The game is, I'm going to put the price of 6, I'm going to put the price of 8. Well, if you put the price of 6, I'm going to react back to 6. Now, because I can't get enough customers to, get enough volume, my profits are extremely low. I'm at 6, you're at 6, my profits are extremely low, your profits are extremely low, I have to raise my price to 7, so what do? Oh, you'll also raise your price to 7 because at 6 you aren't making enough profit, so you raise your price to 7, and then, now that we're both at 7, I decide to raise my price to 8, you decide to raise your price to 8, and we're back at this original price. And then my profits aren't going quite as well, and I say, okay, I'm going to, cheat again, or I'm going to try to, one more time, play the game with 6, so I'm going to lower the price at 6 just for today, and tomorrow I'll raise my price, and then, so I made an awful lot of money on one day when I was doing 6 and the price was 8. So what do you do tomorrow? You say, oh, you're going to play these games with me? Tomorrow, when my price is 8, you lower suddenly your price at 6, and suddenly I'm bleeding, right? And this is kind of like a punishment. Say, oh, if you play these games with me, meaning like lower the price to steal most of my customers so that you run the losses, I'm going to do the same with you. And now I have to figure out well, it's not really a good idea to lower the price on 6. Because I'm going to make some more money today, but tomorrow you're going to respond with kind of like a punishment. You're going to do this on me, and I'm going to, make enough losses where at the end of the day I will have made less overall money than otherwise. So you design this type of a game where the one does something, the other one responds. Well, there may be 3 people as over here. All right.
I have a question. Isn't like there are regulations who forbids these?
Yes, that's what the point. The point is that the law forbids any type of, we call it collusion, when 2 or more parties get together to get their pricing set up so as to profit at the expense of the consumers. Right. So yes, there are laws and there are regulations. But if there are only 2 companies, and I'm the only one and you're the only other, and what's to prevent me to give you a phone call and say, hey, I'm thinking of raising the price a little bit from 10 to 12, what do you think? And you say, oh, that would be great. I'd love to see your price of 12, and mine will be 12 too. Well, is that how do you prove we actually spoke about the price of 10 to 12?
Can they do that? I mean, if
Well,
there are only two price leaders in the market.
Well, the question is whether they can do that. It's completely different. They do it all the time. The question is, can the Department of Justice prove that when I gave you that call, that we actually spoke about raising the price so that both of us can profiteer at the expense of consumers? That's where the real question is. So the question is, they do it all the time. Do they do it in Bulgaria? Yes, they do it in Bulgaria. So it's common, you know, it's a daily practice. Every little business will get their act together. Now, how do they do it? They have this kind of like organization between all, let's say, construction companies. You have 5 or 10 major construction companies. They get together and they say, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, and say, to protect the interest of the construction industry. You may have some other industry. It could be airplanes. So for only 2 or 3 airplane companies, you know, they get together to protect. Well, this is what bankers do. They do it all the time. They have their little organization which takes care of them. We call it the central bank. So the central bank sets the interest rate for all banks, all right? It sets it in the name of commercial banks in order to allow them to profit the most. So whatever is, so the central bank has the inherent interest to protect the income and the profits of commercial banks. That's what it does. Well, they say it's to, you know, to have the depositor to be safe and secure. They also say it's in the name of, let's say, so that banks don't rip off their customers by giving them loans at 25 or 50% where they can't figure out what's going on, all those things. But at the end of the day, central banks are always there first and foremost to protect commercial banks. When a commercial bank gets in trouble, what's the central bank do? Bailout. That's what they do. They do bailouts. In other words, the primary job of a central bank is a bailout. Commercial banks are like its own babies. It takes care of all of them. All right. So they do a lot with the regular. Now they also do so. They also put in regulations in order to enforce oligopolies so that they don't cheat too much on each other. You know, the interest rate is whatever, and suddenly 1 or 2 banks want to lower substantially the interest rate. Well, that won't work because the central bank say, "Oh, you're kind of like cheating." In other words, it is a regulation and you're in violation. So, in other words, a lot of times they put themselves something like an enforcer. And the enforcer will enforce the oligopolistic behavior within the industry. But this is nothing yet with game theory. Game theory is just you and me, or maybe 3 of us, and we're both selling bricks to construction companies, and my bricks are pretty much the same as yours, the same as yours. So only 3 of us, and I can, you know, start playing and say, okay, I'm going to make me a full commitment and 5 construction companies. So 5 construction companies got to hook up with only 3 brick companies. And I'm going to make me a unique agreement with only 1, the major player, that I will be supplying him bricks at a particular price, or whatever the price might be. The price might be 2 cents lower than somebody else. And now we're getting into some legality. Well, is it legal or illegal that I will undercut whatever everyone else is? And now we're going to have some exclusive contracts. Exclusive contract mean that, for example, if you're going to be buying bricks in this country, you're going to be buying it from me and only from me and nothing else but me. And if I'm going to be supplying bricks to you, I'm going to be supplying them to you and whatnot. So as long as you're buying from me only, I'll be selling to you only. And, you know, this is kind of like a little bit to hurt the competition. Well, is it illegal? Is it not illegal? So what happens now? Now you got to figure out the other 2, the other construction companies say, oh, we're in trouble. Now we were 5 companies. 1 of them has already locked in 1 supplier. Now what's the second one going to do? Well, it would want to lock in his or her own supplier, right? 5 construction companies, only 3. So now the second one will want it, so it's going to be a bidding war between some of the rest. So now you begin to forecast what's going on. And the idea is Now, one will start a bidding war, the second one will start a bidding war, and then the third one will say, oh, I'm not going to bid for this one. Now they're going to start bidding war for the other two. So the four will begin a bidding war for the other two. And, you know, the point is that once you begin this strategic behavior, and once you get into certain contracts, suddenly others will become aggressive. They will not just sit and wait to see that, you know, their profits are falling. They'll become aggressive. So they will become aggressive in different ways. They may undercut their prices, or they may offer higher prices, or they may do some other deals with other suppliers, or they may decide to open their own business of bricks and whatnot. In other words, the behavior of one person affects the other. And when it affects the other person will not stay idle, doing nothing and getting hurt. The other person will react. But if I will do something and you will react, what I want to do is I want to do something in such a way that, knowing I've done it, I can forecast how you're going to react, and by forecasting how I'm going to react, I'm going to react on your reaction, and you're going to react on my reaction. We're going to end up somewhere in something that is kind of like longer term, relatively stable. Well, we call this, you know, you react, I react, and whatnot. We end up in a situation, we call this an equilibrium. This is a situation where we kind of like end up after a few repetitions. Alright? So this is kind of like where the game theory. And it could be a one-step process. It's going to be a one-time game. We play it only once. For example, two criminals, right? This is the classic example of prisoner's dilemma. Two criminals, they did a certain crime, and they come to them and say, if you admit, you're going to get a very low grade. If you don't, low sentence. If you don't admit, but the other guy admits, you're going to get a very high sentence. In other words, it's a certain crime. It happens only once. It could be a repeat game where it happens every Christmas. All right. So you have different types. It could be a game where everyone plays simultaneously. It could be a game where the first plays, the second responds, the third plays, the fourth responds, and so forth and so forth. So the idea is you have thousands of little variations, and each variation is another article for another professor and another cushy, professorship at a university based on 3 or 4 game theories. And then the game theories are at first non-cooperative, where I'm trying to get the best that I can get, but then you can get into cooperative games. They develop now companies which are, trying to help each other. Well, why would companies help each other? Well, for the same reason that a husband and wife help each other. They are owned by a third company. All right? When they're owned by a third company, now, they start, helping each other. So now you get into the world of cooperative games. Again, repetitive cooperative games. So, in other words, it becomes an endless array of possibilities. As long as you can come up or make up one more game, this means one more publication, this means ever more cushier jobs. And the reality is far, far away from these from all of these games, like, as if they're thinking, well, if I have for example, Super Bowl, every year you got a Super Bowl. And on the Super Bowl, I got to decide, Pepsi's got to decide how much it will advertise, Coke's got to decide how much it will advertise. If Pepsi advertises an awful lot, and Coke doesn't advertise, it will boost its sales and profits. But what if Pepsi advertises a lot, Coke also advertises a lot, each spent 20 million on advertising? Well, at the end of the day, consumers aren't going to be buying more Cokes and Pepsi, they're going to be buying the same old quantity, but they just lost 20 million on advertising. Well, TV advertisers love this kind of advertising wars, that's a different story. But the point is, suddenly both of them turned out losers, alright? So the point is, you have to begin to think who does what and how. If I do this, if the one has no advertising budget but the other one plans for a 20 million budget, well, you can't just not respond. You have to respond. You can think in terms of, now, do you now have like two mobile suppliers?
STC and mobile.
Right. Okay, so STC, is there like an advertising war and they keep advertising and everyone's... Yes, big advertising, everyone's trying to get more customer.
It's becoming funny.
Yes, it's become to the point of totally ridiculous or ludicrous.
They spend a lot of money on that.
Yes, it's identical in Bulgaria. They advertise, they have these extremely ridiculous, where they have these commercials and they talk to each other. The one is in the one room, the other is in the other room, because they're too lazy to walk upstairs to talk to his wife, right? Of course, the guy is big and fat, right? And then you have this slim and nice, good-looking guy, and the same story, honey, all these kind of things. And these are stupid commercials, but they're desperate because they have to advertise. Because if they don't advertise, you're going to be switching. And if they're switching, you kind of like lose the revenue. The problem with these types of product is that usually you lock in the customer for a while. And if the customer if you lose the customer, you can lose him for 1, 5, 10, 20 years. You can lose him forever. So actually, a customer is extremely variable because the value of the customer is not simply the revenue that you make or the profit margin that you make. For example, if I pay 200 real on my mobile each month, for example, and they make on me 150, for example, it's not, the profit for them is not, and the value is not 150. The value is the discounted present value of all 150 reals for each month for a long, long time, for the next 10 years. Alright, so essentially if they'll get for 10 years, let's say 100 months, they'll get 150 reals. The non-discounted value will be 15,000 real, right? 15,000 real. So they can get 15,000 real out of me. So I'm way more valuable than just this monthly, because the switching, once you switch, they can lock you in for a couple of months or a couple of years. So they do these ridiculous things, and then they have this pricing where they just give you, maybe, at least in Bulgaria, for the first 3 months you get extremely low, and for the weekends they're always free, but then after 3 months you switch back to...
After 5 minutes, okay, there's like a discount. After 5 minutes.
Yeah, if you talk for 5 minutes, after the 5th minute it's a discount. But you can also have a friend within the network. If you have only two. These are the same games that they play in Bulgaria. And as you can, I can tell you 10 of these, and I'm sure that all those 10 will be here because, marketing guys are relatively cheap. They got a pretty crappy education where, it doesn't take a lot of originality. If marketing guys in Bulgaria, competing, only 2 companies can come up with a marketing campaign, the guys will come up here with the same campaign. I mean, they started in the same American universities, got the same textbooks. So they come up with the same campaign, and then they respond with another campaign. We're going to give you free weekends, unlimited weekends. And they say, oh, we're going to give you free weekends too. And we're going to give you also with 5 people. You're kind of like, the family thing. So with 5 people, you talk unlimited, free, anytime, anywhere, whatever, and all the stuff. And they say, oh, we're going to give this too. And they say, okay, and we're going to give this, and we're going to give... In other words, they come up with all those things, but it turns out that all the countries in the world, they pretty much do the same thing over and over again. That's because that's human nature. That's how they think. That's how they try, kind of like to attract customers for that. And the customers will usually switch into this and switch into that. And in Bulgaria, you know what usually customers end up with? Because of all of these plans and everything else, customers, and you can see people always with 2 mobiles, walking with 2 mobiles. Because it turns out that, a whole bunch of friends are on the one. For example, they say, if you're talking with, for example, mobile, it talks with STC, it's 1 real per minute. But if you talk mobile to mobile, it's only 10. Halal, whatever. So suddenly the price is 10 times lower. So, I'm going to talk with all of my friends, mobile friends on my mobile, so that the charge is 10 times less and the price is 10 times less. And at the same time, for all the STC people, I'm going to use, an STC. So suddenly everyone's walking in Bulgaria with 2 mobiles. Yeah. So what's really happening is they usually think that they can outplay, meaning outgain the consumer, but a lot of times consumer really adjust and say, oh, it's going to be most optimal, so everyone's just carrying it. If you carry it in your bag, you know, what's the problem of throwing a second one? Or what's the problem of throwing in a third one? And you just simply know who's on which network, and you call them from that one. So it may turn out that all of these promotions where you get the regular price for the one company, but at the same time, you get 10 times lower price in between us, it may turn out that both companies are big losers because consumers adjust and actually exploit that opportunity where they just carry to and they, you know, and suddenly when they say, oh, we have conversations only with our network, and this guy never made a conversation to any other network. So suddenly you've kind of like almost lost the guy, right? Because he already has the other phone, he's using the other phone for that. And this is the whole story of game theory. And you can make it infinitely more complicated, but you can begin with chapter whichever it is, 13 from the textbook. I mean, I can go on and on discussing, you know, different Nash equilibria. They had this movie about John Nash and how he did it, how he put in the foundations of Nash, game theory and of equilibrium, blah, 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 but that's not interesting. Let's put a pause and... what is it? Is it a break or is... So we now begin chapter 12, and chapter 12 is about managerial decision with market power. Market power, unlike competition, simply means that the company has the ability to change a little bit the price, effectively to raise the price somewhat without effectively losing all the customers. Saudi Aramco clearly has market power. It can raise its own price by 10 or 20%, and it won't lose all of its sales. We spoke already before. BMW can raise, it has some market power, can raise the price by 10 or 20%, and it will lose some sales, but it won't lose all of its sales. So this is actually the definition: the ability of a firm to raise the price without losing all of its sales. For example, you may have a very hot competition in the industry, let's say gas stations in the United States, and a gas station owner may want to raise by 10 cents his price. Well, it is so competitive, consumers immediately notice 10 cents increase and they move on to the next gas station. They just don't stop here, they stop there. So a gas station could literally lose 90 or 99% of its sales by simply raising just a little bit. Well, the opposite is also true. Gas station might have a little bit lower price. Consumers, being very price conscious, can literally swamp the gas station. He can see long lines. And if the owner is not quite astute before he knows it, he's out of gas. Meaning, you know, whatever the tanks that hold the gasoline are already empty, and he says, no gas, that's it. So, alright, it gives the firm ability to raise the price above the marginal cost and above the, potentially the average cost, and provides the company the ability to extract profit, to make an economic profit. Alright. You may have a very special case of this, and that's monopoly. In other words, you may have only 3 luxury cars, and each, you know, BMW is its own monopoly, but within the luxury segment, it competes with also Mercedes and Audi. But you may have only one single firm offering the product. So, when it does, it can set literally its own price. One of the biggest myths, let's clarify, is that it is generally represented by media and usually or almost always by politicians that a monopoly is simply an evil firm which exploits and profiteers at the expense of consumers, and the other presentation is that monopolies always make an awful lot of money, and that they're always profitable, of course always on the back of the innocent consumer, which is certainly not true. You may get monopoly companies to become so big, so bloated with bureaucracy, having 40, 50 VPs, vice presidents, each, making $1 million or more, to the point where it has become so bloated with bureaucracy, everything is so cumbersome, all the costs are so huge that even a monopoly, no matter how high it raises its price, it can still not cover all of its costs. So, monopolies are not guaranteed a profit. And there is one other thing. A lot of times when you have a monopoly, usually when the monopoly abuses its monopolistic power and raises and raises and raises and raises and raises, we have in Bulgaria central heating. The whole capital of Sofia, maybe 70-80% of apartments will have central heating. And the central heating is the monopolist. So they put, through the radiators, the heating and whatnot, and they raise and raise and raise and raise. And at one point, the consumer gets sick and tired and say, no, we can't pay all of this. So what consumers do is they disconnect their own radiators and say, we're not going to use the service anymore. Similarly with telephones. A telephone company, once it was privatized, it raised and raised and raised and raised and raised, and there began something of a different type, a mobile. And people said, oh, we're just going to disconnect. My father just recently disconnected his regular landline telephone. Says there is no point in paying that kind of money. Plus, he just got himself on internet, so now we can have, go on Skype and talk with him, right? Mm-hmm. So, the point is, a monopolist can abuse his monopolistic power, but usually, sooner or later, consumers adjust. Now, in Bulgaria, we have very tight oligopoly, which acts as a monopoly, in the sense that at the same time, in the day, they all raise the price by the same amount. Everywhere, in the whole country. Is it like 5 of them acting as one? Well, they raise and raise and raise and raise gasoline, and what people do? They switch over to something else. Or they just stop using it. So, monopolies do not have a guarantee on profits. They believe usually that they have locked in the customers because there is no alternative, but the alternative is not to be a customer at all. The extreme case of monopoly where government takes a huge monopoly of everything, the ultimate escape from the monopoly is what? Move into another country. Alright? In other words, sometimes the monopoly might be choking so much, not only the industry, but the consumer, the whole economy, to the point of saying it's not even worth living anymore in this country. It could be some third world country or whatnot. Alright. Monopolies usually have some barriers to entry. That's one of the keys in monopolistic competition in general. In general, you have some type of a barrier to entry, which is coming fairly soon. Now, how do we measure market power? Well, market power you can measure in different ways. One is if you raise the price, what percentage you're going to lose from your customers. All right, that's the basic way to measure it. But the overall idea of measuring, is through elasticity. If demand is inelastic, the company has very high market power. If demand is very elastic, the company has relatively little market power. So market power is inversely related to elasticity. Part of elasticity is availability of substitutes. So you have a landline telephone, it gives certain things. Well, the mobile is not a perfect substitute, it's a fairly decent substitute. So the ability to get a close substitute. But for my father, it turns out that the internet, Skype, became sufficiently close substitute. Alright, so what else? When demand is perfectly elastic, the firm has literally no market power. Well, what does it mean perfectly elastic? It simply means that demand is horizontal. And if it's horizontal, we're back to perfect competition. Alright, there is a learner, sometimes pronounced as Lerner index, because it's Abba Lerner, I think is a Swedish economist, which provides you a measure of market power, and it simply says how much higher you can charge over the marginal cost. Ideally, in a competitive market, the price will equal marginal cost, and profit maximization will occur where the price equals marginal cost. This is in competition. Well, if marginal cost is 50, if the company can charge 60, the learner index will tell you 60 minus 50, you can charge an extra 10, and divided by 50, you measure it in percentage terms, like 20%. If you can charge 100 on a marginal cost of 50, the learner index is 100%. 50 divided by 50. In other words, how much more you can charge over your costs. The idea is that during competition, if there is plenty of competition, if you charge a lot above your cost, that extra profit will attract a lot of competition, and competitors will compete away and will shrink your profit. Ideally, in a perfectly competitive environment, the profitability is zero. Economic profit is zero, and you cannot charge over the marginal cost. If you have market power, you can charge. And if you have more market power, you can charge more above the marginal cost. Question?
Is market power related to the market? Meaning, if the company has a big market share,
usually yes. Usually yes. Usually if they have a big market share, yes. But the question is also different. You may be relatively big and others may be relatively small. And if you try to shrink your output, your quantity of output, in order to raise the price for everyone, kind of like what is the situation with Saudi Arabia within OPEC or within the global industry, the question always is whether competitors have sufficient capacity to fill in the gap. In other words, if Saudi Arabia shrinks by 3 million its output in order to raise dramatically global oil prices, the question is, are competitors, meaning other countries, because Saudi Arabia does compete with Russia, Iran and whatnot, so will the others have the ability to supply, and by shrinking your quantity, others will simply expand, and by this you'll surrender for nothing your market share. You will reduce substantially your profits, and they will increase substantially theirs, and all you do is transfer your market share from you to them. So size is very important, but elasticity of supply is also quite important. But it is not the most important. It's actually elasticity of demand is the one which determines market power. Just being big is not good enough. All right? Is that kind of like answering the question?
Yeah. So elasticity also matters.
Elasticity of demand is determinant. Size is not as important. If you're big, you may have market power only if elasticity of supply. You can't just say elasticity. There's elasticity of demand, elasticity of supply.
For example, oil, it's inelastic. So it's
so we say demand for oil is inelastic, or supply for oil is inelastic. Yes, demand for oil is inelastic. So Saudi Arabia possesses certain market power. All right. Now, why they don't exercise it on January 24th of 2009, where the price is 42, and why they don't cut even more, is a whole different story. It may not be. You got to understand, oil is the most important commodity in the world, and its price is driven also by politics and by geopolitics besides pure profit. All right? So you cannot, it's very difficult to analyze from purely oligopolistic point of view or from market power point of view what happens, for the simple reason is that there's a big picture. You're having a war coming up with Iran, maybe. You're already maybe having a war between Pakistan and India. And I don't, you have much bigger picture to be concerned about. Are we going to make 150 billion this year or 160 billion this year? In the big picture, in the big scheme of things, the extra 10 billion mean nothing. There are a lot bigger, strategic alliances, whether it's US, whether it's Russia, whether it's Germany, whether it's China. Strategic alliances, geopolitics is much more important. So oil for these types of things is not a very good example because it's not a pure market behavior. Behavior is not market driven, it's politics driven. Alright, is this clarifying? Move on. Alright, so learner index, that covered most of this. Okay. If consumers view two goods as substitutes, cross elasticity will. So, if consumers see STC and mobile as very close substitutes, then there is neither has very strong market power. All right. For example, in Bulgaria, as gasoline prices went up and up and up and up, and consumers got sick and tired, they put in the LPG, which is kind of like natural gas, propane, butane. They put in the LPG system. Suddenly, I see gasoline and LPG as perfect substitutes. It's a flip of a button, and electronically I can switch from gasoline to LPG, and from LPG to gasoline. Suddenly, in other words, at some circumstances, they may not be really good substitutes, but at some point down the road, if you get to abuse that oligopolistic or monopolistic position, consumers adjust and somehow create new substitutes. All right, and if you create the new substitute, then suddenly, market power begins to shrink rapidly. Question?
In Saudi Arabia, there is no substitute for oil, right?
What you mean, crude oil?
Yes.
Yeah, no one's using crude oil in Saudi Arabia. Crude oil is not valuable commodity. Only its derivatives are.
Yeah.
Right? You gotta understand, it's the gasoline. So crude oil itself is not used in anything.
Okay.
Only its derivatives. Once you refine it, you have 150 products. Then yes. So what about it?
For the products, there is a substitute, but for the oil, there is no substitute.
Correct. So for many of the products, actually, there are different substitutes within the product group. But for the source from which you make them, we call it the input, there is no substitute. Sometimes natural gas may turn out to be a decent substitute.
Yes, but we are not using it in Saudi Arabia, so there is no substitute.
Right, there are no substitute, but you have to also understand that in Saudi Arabia, pricing of all oil derivatives is also not necessarily driven by market and by profit. You may have regulations, you may have political considerations too. So sometimes it's very difficult also to analyze markets for food. In Bulgaria, food is one of the most political commodities. I mean, politicians use it to bribe, the electorate. Social policy, we're going to give a lot of stuff. So a lot of times, the price of food is driven politically. Politicians say to food companies, these are the prices, you can't raise them a lot, and if you do, bad things will happen to you. In other words, politicians can threaten with legal or legislation or whatever, and food companies. So some commodities are highly political, and we're not talking about those. Politicians are, they're driven by political cycles, by political favors, by a whole range of other things which are non-economic in nature. So you always have to think, is something a political commodity or not? So here, internally, gasoline is political, right? I mean, does it have huge subsidy? Yes. Is the price fixed at 60? Yes. Has the price of oil gone up 5 times, at least early in the year, and gasoline stays at 60? Right? Yes. So apparently, it was not driven by the market. The market did not, meaning there was no market response. It was what it was because it was based on a political decision. So you have to differentiate when you are in business, whatever the business is, whether you're into a political commodity, whatever the commodity is, or not. In other words, some commodities are considered important for social purposes. They're like social commodities. And once a commodity is social, suddenly it's always immediately political too. So it may be political because of geopolitics on a global scheme, or because of internal politics for social purposes.
Professor, does it affect, raising the prices, does it affect everybody or only a certain, like we have rich people and
yeah, well, in every country in the world you have a lot of rich people and have a lot of poor people.
So does it affect even the rich people, like for example food?
No,
if they rise like rice prices, for example.
Yes. The answer is rich people are usually less affected by this policy. So, usually only the poor people are affected because they spend a significant percentage of their own income, they spend it on that commodity. So, usually what they want to do is lower food and energy specifically for social purposes, to make the cost of living relatively bearable. In other words, if you can give people some cheap food and cheap energy, there will not be a revolution. It's all about two things. Either revolution or social revolt and throwing out the politicians and replacing them with other politicians, all right? So, what politicians are always afraid is of one thing: unemployment. How do you become an unemployed politician? Well, when the government gets changed, you're suddenly unemployed. So, the idea is politicians always want to keep the masses happy, and basically you keep the masses happy by keep them, fed and warm. In other words, by giving them relatively low food and
so
by
if
giving
you speak
them...
about inelasticity, it relates to a certain segment,
Yeah, to a certain commodity.
The social...
To a certain commodity. No, it relates...
No, I'm talking about the people.
No.
The demand.
Elasticity of demand relates to particular commodity. There is one elasticity of demand for this camera, all right? There's a different elasticity of demand for watches. There's a third elasticity for shirts. There's for ties, for shoes, for cameras, for textbooks. So for every single product, there is a particular elasticity of demand. Of course, there's also elasticity of supply. So you have to consider what the product is, you have to consider its elasticity, and you also have to consider what are the close substitutes. Are the substitutes good enough or not? For example, if we're using this textbook by Managerial Economics by Thomas and Maurice. Well, it's not showing in there. Thomas and Maurice. Is there a different textbook, Managerial Economics, which is a close substitute that you can use and prepare for this particular course so that you can get still a comparable, decent grade instead of using this one? Well, sometimes it's perception, right? Sometimes it's, well, I'd rather just use this one because that's what we use, and that's what everybody uses, that's what I use, all right? So you consider this to be relatively inelastic. Well, this is what publishers like to do. This one is McGraw-Hill. They like to somehow, if they could, lock in professors into their product, and if they lock in professors, they really hope and pray or have the marketing strategy that professors will lock in the students and force the students to pay exorbitant prices, all right? But there is something else. What publishers do is, McGraw-Hill, International Edition. What does it mean, International Edition?
I think he's American.
Huh?
I think he's American. This is
Not
not
only
for
publication.
USA.
What does it mean?
Publication of it's going to be sold only outside.
Yes, it will be sold only abroad. Why only abroad? So as not to undercut its own market price in the United States. So they do this price differentiation. In the United States, this costs $150,000, and of course it is available only in hardcover and luxury and everything else, and they charge 3 times higher price. Over here it's available, you know, for cheap, poor Bulgarians. Our average income in the capital is roughly $400 a month. No Bulgarian is going to pay $150, but if it's $40, $50, $60, some will. So what they do is a 2-tier pricing system. Sometimes they may do a 3-tier pricing system, where they have extremely high price where the market can bear very high price. Then they'll try to separate the two markets. So they say, this copy is illegal. Can you zoom in here? Are you zooming in? It says, this international student edition is for use outside of the US.
They can't use it inside the US?
Yes, it's strictly illegal to use it inside the US.
Oh.
Why? So, because if you can sell it in the US for 50,
Yes, they will lose.
yeah, they'll lose a lot of money. They'll lose, you got it?
Yeah.
So, the idea is that if they use it in the US, you'll do what's called arbitrage.
Yes.
You know, you order them over here, you know, about 5,000 copies.
And you pay for more.
Yeah, you ship them over in the US, sell them for 70, and make a lot of money. And make a lot of money at the expense of McGraw-Hill. Well, McGraw-Hill aren't that stupid. They just won't let you do that. And this is what this yellow sticker says. And if somebody tries to sell it with the yellow sticker in the US, someone will come, tap you on the shoulder and say, we need to talk to you. Meaning, you're in trouble.
You're under arrest.
All right? You're in trouble. And we want to find the network that is doing this, you know.
So the more elastic a demand is, the more power a company has?
So, no. The more elastic it is, the less the market power. The more inelastic it is, the more market power. In other words, the most market power have by commodities which are naturally inelastic. By nature, inelastic are commodities have 2 characteristics. One is no close substitute, that will be oil. The other characteristic is it is a necessity. You gotta have it because you gotta have it. Kind of like you gotta eat just because you have to eat. Right? So, oil possesses in this particular case these 2 critical characteristics. Now, foods has a lot of different, but eventually when you get down to wheat and rice and maize or corn, they have their little substitutes otherwise. You know, I mean, they are a staple food. We discussed this 5, 6, 7 lectures ago, and they are necessary. You can't just replace bread in Europe. Bread is what everyone eats on, breakfast, lunch, dinner. All right. So the same thing is you can't just replace. No. In China, rice. You can't just replace it. I mean, it has substitutes, but it can't just for 2 billion Chinese and Indians, 2.5 million. You can't just replace rice. It just doesn't work. So, as long as it's necessity with little available substitute. Now, there is some substitutability, some between rice and wheat, but overall, they don't. All right? Same with oil. Of course, oil has natural gas is becoming more and more of a substitute, but still, it's not a practical substitute. It can't be a practical substitute for a whole humanity. I can replace it in my car, and maybe 5,000 or 5 million Bulgarians can replace it in their cars, but globally, America can't. Or globally, China can't. Or globally, India can't. So, you have to think in terms of the commodity, what the market is. Are we talking about the Bulgarian market, where they could be, or are we talking about the global market? So, within Bulgaria, we can substitute rice with wheat fairly, rice with wheat fairly easily and be nimble. But overall, a whole Asia can't do the substitution.
So it's inelastic in Asia.
Yes, relatively inelastic in Asia. And global demand will be relatively inelastic. Relatively inelastic, global demand. So, what you have to do, and this is part of kind of like, I'm touching on some of your exam, is you have to see how you define the market. Do you define the market for gasoline and gas in Bulgaria? Do you define it in Europe? Or do you define it in, the global market? Because you will have fundamentally different implications. right? Like we discussed, you know, they shut, the Russians shut the gasoline in Bulgaria, and in Ukraine, and CNN shows, you know, this TV where, you know, poor little Bulgarian children are freezing in the dark, you know, in the cold and whatnot. But, you know, they don't ask the question, wait a minute, in every room in Bulgaria, we got electric plug, like, you know, we have electric plug over here. What's preventing them to plug in the, you know, the heater, electric heater, and stay warm? What's preventing
They
them?
don't have money to buy the heater.
Huh?
They don't have money to buy the heater.
Oh, well, so the problem is not that Russia cut off the gasoline, which is what propaganda, BBC propaganda tells. That's not the problem. The problem is fundamentally different. They are too poor to afford the heater, or that they are too poor to afford the electricity. Alright? You see, the problem at its core is not that, you know, three-year-old little girl is freezing in the, you know, in the cold and whatnot. And of course they show them in the office, and in these nice pictures. The problem is fundamentally different. The problem is they can't afford, for whatever reason, the electricity. The problem is they can't get some other type of oven with wood. And Bulgarians do use wood. Why they don't have wood? What's the problem?
It's very cheap, yeah.
Yeah, it's very cheap. It's extremely cheap in Bulgaria. You know, what's the problem doing that? And they show these pictures, you know, with, you know, little children suffering, and they call for compassion. And see the evil Russians, what they do to innocent, you know, little children in Bulgaria, and, you know, all the way around. But they don't tell the story. Again, so that's back to the point. What's the question again?
Elasticity of demand, how does it affect the market power?
Okay, so it is the most important determinant of market power. And in turn, it depends on whether it's a necessity or not, and whether it has a substitute or not. Alright? Was good enough?
Yes.
Move on? Is it time for a break?
Yes.
You want to take a break? Alright, take a break. You got it?
Yes, sir.
No,
What's the product?
no, hold on.
Okay.
Alright, so,
The first question was about product. As we
Okay.
discussed, Saudi oil, there is no there is just
Crude oil.
okay, if you discuss crude oil is only crude oil, there are no other products. If you want to enter a completely different industry, for example, engine oils.
Yes.
Engine oil is a derivative of crude oil. You got to get into the world of engine oils. It has nothing to do with the crude oil industry.
Yeah.
Now you got to get into different refiners, who does what. Now you have to tell me what are the brand names of engine oils, do they have substitutes, what the pricing. So it's completely different market. Engine oil market is fundamentally different from the crude oil market.
Okay.
Now you could have other petroleum derivative products. Again, each of them has its own, but you can't just do the whole petroleum industry. You should focus strictly on crude oil.
Okay.
Whatever you do, you need to focus your product to be manageable. Maybe one, maybe two, maybe three products. Okay, you can't just use everything, the whole industry.
Then what? Talk about the product itself, or
Yes, that's number one. You first describe what the product is. So probably I should have put in there, which I kind of like forgot, but it's part of it. What is the market? How you define the market. How you define the market. So, I mean, do you define Saudi crude oil? In other words, you have something, some unit, which competes within a larger context. So it will be, as I explained already, Ford competing with other American automakers, or Ford competing with other automakers on the US market. So it competes with Germans, it competes with Japanese. Or you can Ford competing globally with Japanese, Germans, and everyone else. And now somehow you got to define the product,
Yeah,
and then the market. And the market will also include either geography or the market niche, whatever that niche is. Alright, so you have to define what the market is. So once you define the product with the market, you have effectively defined the industry. I mean, the idea of all that we're talking for the last 3 weeks is that we're talking about so-called industrial analysis. You analyze the particular industry. Now, the fundamental of any industrial analysis is always demand and supply. Always demand and supply. Demand and supply is fundamentals for everything. But once you have demand and supply, you have to see the market structure. Well, market structure, which are the last, let's see, 3 chapters. So, profit maximization in various market structures. So, market structure itself is simply the structure of the industry. But what is an industry? And I just explained. You have to find a product and you have to define the geographical area. In other words, you have to define the industry, which is the same as the market itself. Okay? So, you may have purely competitive, you may have oligopolistic type of competition, you may have monopoly or monopolistic type of competition. So you have to see what simply the industry is, again, what the product is, what the nature of the industry is. Alright, is it kind of clarifying?
It's answering a couple of questions.
Yes.
The following. We answered this like a market structure. We're also answering question number 6.
Oh, okay. What's number 6?
The market power and also...
Yes, market power. Okay, market power is, you simply have to tell me, does the company or the industry, in other words, does, if it's Saudi Arabia, have a market power on the global oil market? Or does it have market power on, let's say within OPEC? Or if you chose a dairy industry, does your dairy industry have a market power? In a sense, it can raise dramatically the prices on consumers if it chooses to. Alright, it may have a market power in a different sense, but it's kind of like you lower the price to crush the competition.
Yes.
Well, that's the next topic, which we call competitiveness. Competitiveness, you're extremely competitive when you have the ability to lower the price dramatically, crush the competition, and then what? Raise it even more than it was before, now that you have already crushed the competition. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes. What about pricing power and pricing position?
Now, pricing power also refers to one other thing. You have to, at any point in time, for any industry, you have to clarify which are the barriers to entry. In other words, competition is determined not only by the number of competitors, but is also determined by the ability of potential entrants to actually enter the industry. Well, can they easily enter? Is it with a difficulty? So some industries it's extremely easy to enter. We're talking about opening like a little food store here in Saudi Arabia, kind of like a little room, and it just, sell, whatever, little bread, little cans, and whatever you sell. I understand it's extremely easy to open such a store, right? Yes, extremely easy, no problem. Now, try to open the third mobile communication.
There is actually.
Well, there may be. Okay, try to open a fourth one. Turns to be next to hard, next to impossible. Plus, it may require $500 million of capital. All right, it may require $500 million of capital. So you have to determine the barriers to entry. If it's pharmaceutical, you may have 5 or 3 major chains of pharmaceutical companies which have a lockup on the market, whether it's due to licenses or whether they have the government in their pocket, right? And the government will not give a license. For example, can you just open a pharmacy here in Saudi Arabia without the government license?
No.
Right, it's impossible in America. In Europe, no one can open a pharmacy without proper government license. And guess what? In Bulgaria, it's extremely difficult to get one unless you're one of those big chains, right? So now in Bulgaria, they try to do one other little dirty trick on the big chains, is you can open a pharmacy only if you're a licensed pharmacist. So what happens? You got in the country 600 licensed pharmacists, So you suddenly limit the number of pharmacists to 600.
Professor, this is market power or pricing power?
This is market power.
But you said
No,
no.
we are not.
No. Okay, hold on. This is
Pricing power.
barriers to entry which allow for market power.
Okay.
In other words, you have market power only you have limits on competitors. Only if you can limit competitors to enter, only then you have market power. All
We
right?
are talking about
What's pricing power?
What is the barrier to entry?
Okay, hold on, one at a time. Okay, if we,
If we are talking about Saudi oil,
okay,
yes, what is the barrier to entry?
well, can you just go and put in and just pump oil?
No.
Well, why not? Why can't we just go there and pump us some oil? What do you mean? We can't do this?
No, we cannot.
Why not? Why not?
Because the oil is nationalized.
Ah, you see, there is a barrier to entry. It is not mine to take and it's not yours to take. It is national. It is government owned. So, if you can't have it because it's illegal to have. So, it is against the law to just go in and pump for oil. Well, can just Russian guys come over here and pump?
Okay.
No. So the government has nationalized it. Second, it has monopolized it, and will simply not allow. This is the perfect barrier to entry you'll ever find in the world. Government says it's mine, only mine, and no one else shall have it but me. Period. Of course, it happens for a lot of other
Wait,
things.
so if I found it in my farm,
In Saudi Arabia, if it's oil, it is still not yours. It is still not yours.
like gold.
No, they will buy it from
Okay. Come on, please. Let's focus on what we're doing over here. When we're done, you're gonna get your argument and fight outside. All right? So let's see more questions. So we are talking about market power. Market power is based on the level of competition, and level of competition is based on barriers to entry. If you have the ability to limit competitors to enter, you certainly could potentially possess market power. Of course, if you cannot limit competitors to enter, you can't possibly have market power. Why not? Very simple. As soon as you try to raise the price and increase the profitability, someone's going to come in and enter the market.
Maybe the quality is different. Maybe the quality.
Oh, now we're talking about a completely different issue, which is that chapter that we were doing up until recently, which is product differentiation. Light, sweet, crude is the same all over the world. Of course, it has different grades and different weights and different, sulfur content and whatnot. So once you begin to talk about different quality, you talk about product differentiation. We're talking about what we entered. This is the whole chapter of monopolistic competition. If it's monopolistic competition, we are back to what we discussed earlier on. Do consumers perceive that the products are substitutable or not? To what extent they perceive that one product can substitute for a different product? To what extent they perceive that a Mercedes is a good substitute for a BMW, right? Again, they may say, no problem, for them it's just the same thing, the CEO wouldn't even care, but for a big fan it was going to make a world of difference, all right? So, again, the product differentiation then depends on, is there substitutability? To what extent consumers think or perceive it as substitutable? Well, the substitutability will determine the elasticity. If they are highly substitutable, it will be highly elastic. So the market power will be reflected in the elasticity itself. But the elasticity will be determined by the two factors which I already discussed early on. Number one, to what extent it is necessary and you gotta have it just because you have to have it. And the second extent is to what extent you have substitutes and how consumers perceive the substitutes. Now, the perceptions of the substitutes most often depend on not reality, but marketing. One of the most important tasks or goals of marketing is to convince the consumer that the product is not substitutable. That you gotta have it, and that if you get anything else, you won't be getting the same quality, the same service, the same effectively product. So this is what one of the main goals of marketing is, to try to convince that the product is unique, to create a niche of its own, and to create market power for the company which owns and produces the product. So this is the interaction between microeconomics, market power, and the subject of marketing, which is a different subject.
I have a question regarding the complements. We studied that the complements, for example, is like tea and sugar.
Correct.
And if the price of tea went up, people won't be consuming sugar because they're related to each other. So if the price of oil was high, will people stop consuming like cars and these things? Or
no. Did you see the price of oil went up 5
because
times?
it's inelastic, right?
Yes.
Okay, so
Yes.
there isn't like a real complements for oil.
What do you mean?
What are oil complements?
Okay. What do you mean? Whatever you use oil with. You use oil with cars. Cars
Okay,
and oils
that's my
are...
question. So they're complements?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
You use a car only with oil, meaning gasoline, oil derivative. Of course, you got to understand that cars don't run on oil. Cars run on gasoline
Oil
or on
derivatives,
diesel.
and
right?
oil derivatives has complements.
Yes.
Okay.
So they act as a complement, correct?
Okay.
Of course. What you saw was gasoline cars, kind of like, big Jeeps and SUVs and whatnot. As soon as oil shot up through 130, 140, and gasoline in California went up over $5, suddenly the sales of SUVs and Jeeps and Hummers just crashed.
Okay.
So they are more or less perfect complement. So when you're talking about SUV, if SUV is your industry, you have to talk about the most important complement, which is necessarily oil, crude oil, the price of crude oil. All right. I mean, Europe also they run on diesel, but diesel is still made out of
Oil.
crude oil anyway. So yes, you have to consider complements, because you can't just consider the one without considering the complements. If you ignore the complements down the road, you'll get some what we call distortions, which will cause some paradoxes and some illogicality, which could be perfectly... I mean, it's kind of like, oil is going up and say, wow, for no reason, prices of sales of SUVs crash. But if you just look at simply the complement of an SUV, you say, oh, it's perfectly logical.
Okay.
It makes perfect sense.
Can you explain
Yes.
pricing power and pricing decision?
Hmm?
Pricing power and decision.
Okay, well, pricing power is whether you have it or not. Can you raise the price and lose a lot of sales or lose little sales?
You mean pricing?
Hold on. One at a time, please. Be civilized. Okay. Okay, you asked the question. Go ahead.
You mean price that if the company has a market pricing power, they are a marketing pricing maker?
If they have pricing power,
Yes.
they have the ability to set their own price. To a certain extent, they are a price maker, correct? Think of toothpaste, Colgate.
Yes.
Colgate, you like it? At least I do. That's what I do at home, doesn't matter. So, Colgate can raise the price on me 10%, 20%, and I'll take it, man, I'll swallow it, I'll just pay up. Now, but they can't just put the price on me 3 or 5 times. They can't just give me 20 or 50 real for, toothpaste Colgate. I'll just get
Because
another.
they don't have a marketing power.
No, we say they have a limited. They have some
Yes. Okay.
market power. They have some. In other words, market power is not 0, 1. Turn on the lights, turn off the lights. Market power goes from white to black with all the shades of gray in between. So market power, this is what this learner index was effectively showing you, that yeah, you may have, for example, Rolex will have certain market power, okay? Same thing with BMW. Well, can they set their own price? Sure they can, but they can't just abuse. You can't just make a BMW twice more expensive than Mercedes for the same class of car, all right? So there is some, and it's relatively limited.
What kind of products that have the marketing power? Not some marketing power, has the marketing
Pure
power.
marketing power.
Yes.
Well, we were just talking about the supply of oil in Saudi Arabia. Perfect,
Yes.
100% marketing power.
This is the answer.
Yeah, perfect, 100%. So whenever you have some sort of a monopoly, you have extremely high market power. Now, if you have only 2 competitors, you will have some, but you have to take into consideration your competitor. Now, if you have 1,000, you have no market. So the size, the number of competitors is one of the indicators of market power. No, the number of competitors is one. You have 1 or 2, each will have relatively high. You have 1,000. In Bulgaria, up until recently, this was the problem with pharmacies. Every time a pharmacy tries to raise the prices, the retiree, the low-income retiree, say, well, what prices are higher, is just going to walk to the other pharmacy. All right? So the point is, in this town, there are too many sales. Now they're complaining there are too many pharmacies in a small town. There were like 10 pharmacies in a small town. But the problem is not that there are 2 or 10 pharmacies. The problem is that the one pharmacy can't raise the price on its consumers in order to make a lot more money. So that's essentially where the problem is. So number 1 is how many competitors. Number 2, how big player are you? You may be big and you may have ability to influence the whole market, or maybe tiny. I mean, in a huge market, maybe let's say 10 players only, and one of them is extremely tiny. Of course, he has no market power, right? I mean, little or no. You know, the sooner he does anything, they're just going to switch around easily. So that's the second one, and the third determinant was barriers to entry. Barriers to entry.
All the other questions depend on the first question.
Yes, yes, there is a. So again,
Linked to each other.
these questions I did not make them up. I used the textbook and sequentially, one after another, I used them. They are, the logic is sequential and they depend on each other. So they use concepts which tie to each other. You know, from demand, from supply, they all are based on elasticity. Well, elasticity is based on substitutability. You know, all of these concepts are, what we're trying to do now is integrate the whole course together into trying to see and make what we call industry analysis. Okay, question.
Pricing power. Pricing power is determined by the market itself, or is it determined by politics?
No, pricing power is determined and follows entirely out of market power. Pricing power is a consequence of market power. All right? If you have a lot of market power, you will have a lot of pricing power. If you have little or no market power, so market power translates into pricing power. And pricing power hopefully translates into higher profit if you're able to raise prices. But of course, you have to understand, you should never think that the best strategy is always to raise prices because you charge more. A lot of times the best strategy is to lower prices in order to ruin a lot of your competition first, and then leave the market for yourself. So you should never think all this, oh, you just got to raise or you have to raise and whatnot. Not necessarily.
That's my question. What's the difference between a degree of competition in the industry and a degree of competitiveness?
Well, I already explained it very early on, and I'll repeat it one more time.
You said the degree of competitiveness is lowering prices in order to destroy the competition.
Right, so let's try it. Degree of competition refers to the industry, the whole industry. In other words, the automobile, the car industry in Saudi Arabia is highly competitive, period. Just because it is. We're not talking about Toyota, Honda, or whatnot. We're talking about the industry itself. Pharmaceuticals in Bulgaria so far have been extremely competitive. A vicious battle amongst pharmaceutical companies to sell and pharmacies. So it refers entirely to the market, to the industry, to the segment. Now, competitiveness refers to a particular player in the market. So the market may be extremely competitive, and some will be very uncompetitive. All right? For example, the oil market is actually extremely competitive in the world overall. But Iran has very little competitiveness. It also has little pricing power. It also has little market power. The cost is extremely high, maybe $70, maybe $80 is the estimated cost. Of course, they will just not publish it, so you have a lot of scholars who spend months to infer based on a lot of information what's the average barrel. So, Iran can't just cut costs, meaning cut the price of oil, to what we call in English undercut its competitors, but Saudi Arabia can. Why? Because at a price of 40, Iran is bleeding and losing a lot of money. Saudi can still make a lot of money. So, for the same industry, one country is extremely competitive. So we say that we have high competitiveness. And for Iran, they're uncompetitive or have low competitiveness. American automakers are very low, have low competitiveness. They can't compete with Japanese. So again, competitiveness refers to Nissan or Toyota or Honda, all right, or GM or Ford. Is that kind of clarifying? So competitiveness refers the relation of the company to the overall industry. The competition simply refers, what is the industry?
How much does it affect the industry? This company, how much does it affect the industry?
No. How much it affects the industry is to a great extent the market power. It is to what extent it can lower prices and still remain in the business. In other words, the fundamental determinant of competitiveness is the low average costs. So if a cost per barrel, the average cost per barrel in Iran is 70, and here it is 7, going down from hundreds to 80, to 75, to 70, to 60, to 50, Saudi Arabia can go a lot lower. So the competitiveness is higher when the particular player can lower the price further down. So usually the only reason you can lower further down is just because your cost is a lot lower and you can still make money while the others have to lose. What you want to do as a business person is to keep the price sufficiently low so that you can still make some money while you're ruining the competitor. Alright, I mean, here the objective is not for Saudi Arabia to keep the price low to ruin Iran. I never meant that. Yes. But for the Japanese, it could be a perfect strategy to keep those Toyotas sufficiently low in America to ruin GM and Ford and have the whole American market entirely for themselves. That's the idea. So sometimes, that's one of the competitive strategies. So it's not always just raise the price and that's all. All right, that's too primitive. That's too primitive. It could happen, but usually before you want to raise the price, you want to do two things. Destroy the competition and raise barriers to entry. Because if you ruin the competition, but you don't raise the barriers to entry, you raise the price, and as soon as you raise the price, someone else jumps back in, and what good did it do to you? Not much.
Professor, we have a...
Go. All right, let's give her a chance. Go ahead.
We understand the market power, but when you say the pricing power, as you give an example, the toothpaste, for example, Saudi can't just say, I'm going to buy, to raise my price.
For what? For what?
Crude oil, for crude oil, because it's determined by the market.
Partly true, partly not true. Partly not true. If you try and say from 42 now, say, oh, we're going to raise it to 60, others will supply what they supply, but because Saudi Arabia is very large in the oil industry, in the global oil market, it's kind of like, you know, 10%, right? 8 million barrels out of 80. Demand is relatively inelastic. When you raise the price by, let's say, $20, $30, demand will fall by 2 or 3%. So everyone will sell whatever they want to sell, and Saudi Arabia will not be able to sell its 8 million, it will be able to sell only 6 million. So the ability to raise the price also means you'll have to sacrifice certain quantity in order to get the higher price.
So we change the price when we change the quantity.
Yes, you change the price when you change the quantity. Right? In other words, when you raise the price, you have to have a lower quantity. And here is the difference between Saudi Arabia and Iran. If Iran tries to sell at 60 and raise their price at 60, because they have only 2 million barrels of total supply, maybe less, the whole world will buy everything, you know, the rest of the world, and Iran will possibly happen to sell 0 at 60. You see? The problem is they're too small. If they raise at 60, you know, the world will take take 2 million barrels less. They just won't buy any Iranian oil. But because Saudi quantity is 8 million, the world will still shrink by 2, but Saudi Arabia will still be able to sell 6 out of 8. You understand now the difference? So when a large player tries to raise the price, he will lose a quantity and will still be able to sell more. But when a small player, tiny little player, tries to raise the price, he might not be able, he might lose everything. He might lose all the quantity. Is this kind of like making... So this is how the size is so important. But this is for the crude oil industry because it's already set up. But for other industries, it may be the case if there is easier entry that that's not the case. For example, you know, there are only 2 or 3 pharmacies in town, everyone raises prices, then suddenly there is the word that, do you know that the prices of pharmaceuticals, whatever, is twice higher in this little small town? Oh, so high? Yeah, there are only 2 pharmacies. And say, let's go ahead and open a pharmacy. Get a license, what? No, open a license, you know, and move on. In other words, you also need the barriers to entry in the long run, which for the global oil industry are more than perfect for the global oil industry. Now, within the Saudi market, you also have perfect barrier to entry. Questions?
In oil industry, what about the OPEC? Can OPEC members
raise their prices? The answer is, which I discussed last time over here, the answer is in general, yes, they have the power. If they want, they can do it. But the problem with the OPEC cartel is that there is no enforceability within OPEC. If another country, I'm just picking on a country, Libya, is, you know, maybe, well, let's say Iran decides to cheat on their quota. In other words, OPEC gets together, they all agree, and they just, you know, this is what each cut is, and Iran decides to cheat. You can't just go and bomb the hell out of them. It can't happen. It won't happen. There is no way that you can enforce, that you can force the Iranians to pump less. They'll pump whatever they want to pump.
Isn't there like regulations that...
Yeah, again, this is the same story. This is what I'm explaining. You may have all the regulations in the world. You may have the international law. You may have the world court. They don't give a damn. They will do whatever they want to do and say, you know, what are you going to do about it? In other words, what you need in every system is, you need not only laws and regulations, you need enforcement. In other words, the letter of the law is meaningless unless there is genuine enforcement. So, OPEC can agree on anything, but OPEC has no enforcement arm. Nothing. OPEC can do nothing, the whole as an institution, to force that one particular member who is cheating on their quota. Cheating means overproducing their quota. Whatever the quota is, they produce more. So this is where the problem is. The problem is that each member separately has the incentive to overproduce, and each member has the incentive, what is called, to cheat, meaning to produce more than their own quota. That's what we call cheating in the oil industry. And there is no enforcement. So that's the fundamental problem that OPEC has. It has the ability, as long as it can align members to, comply with the cartel policy. But because of lack of enforcement, it's a little bit difficult. Is this kind of explaining?
Yeah. I have actually 3 questions more. Sorry.
Let's see. 3.
Okay, first of all, what do you mean by product differentiation? We should
Product differentiation is what I was explaining over here. Toothpaste. Well, one toothpaste is different. For me, Colgate is sufficiently different from others.
I mean, when we talk about it in oil, do we say the derivatives of oil? How?
Okay, so product differentiation for crude oil will be light sweet crude versus heavy sweet, or light sour or heavy sour. So the differentiation specifically for crude oil will be the weight, the API gravity, and the sourness, which refers to the quantity of sulfur. That's specifically for, differentiation is Toyota different from Honda?
I mean, just to differentiate the types of oil. That's what you mean. We have to know the difference between each type of quality. Yes.
You don't have to. I'm asking in general, what is the differentiation between the products? So I'm asking, is there a difference between a Nokia or a Samsung?
Yes.
Or a Sony? So if you perceive that there is a difference, there is obviously product differentiation. Again, you don't have to understand the crude oil. I'm just asking the general concept.
Another question. What do you mean by pricing decision?
Yes, pricing decision.
We just said that OPEC can't force the prices.
No, pricing decision is simply how the company will choose to price its product in order to maximize its short-term or its long-term profits. So pricing decision is raise the price high, or pricing decision is keep it sufficiently low to keep the volumes high, or pricing decision may be ruinous competitive pricing, meaning you slash the prices 50%, you advertise big, and you hope that you can withstand longer than your competitors, and that you will force your competitors out of business, or at least you will inflict terrible. So the pricing decision simply means, and pricing policies, how you choose strategically to price your product, but you can't price it whatever you want to price it. You gotta consider the competition. You can't just, the current environment, Saudi Arabia just raise oil to 200. It probably won't work, all right? So pricing decision depends on pricing power, depends on market strategy, because usually you will have a long-term strategy. For example, the pricing power of